Chapter 6 Elaborate Doctrine, Weak Class Anchor. As the new communist movement grew and contended with other trends, it further elaborated its theoretical outlook and strategy. Red Papers 1 in 1969 had established the initial framework, and for the next several years this strongly Maoist perspective shaped the movement's agenda. Further, since Maoist ideas held initiative within the wider spectrum of Third World Marxism, they influenced much broader layers of revolutionaries who were also debating such matters as how best to combat racism, what strategy to pursue in the labor movement, and so on. For the new communist movement proper, defining an ideological pedigree and mastering the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism were considered key tasks. Activists delved into study of the labor theory of value and other central components of Marxist political economy, philosophy, and the scientific method of dialectical and historical materialism, and classical communist doctrine concerning the vanguard party and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hundreds of cadre participated in reading groups covering Marx's Capital or portions of Lenin's collected works. The majority read shorter works by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. But study group leaders often found it more expedient to utilize articles by Mao and Stalin, which tended to be even shorter, written in more popular language and more schematic. Two pieces by Stalin were particular favorites: Dialectical and Historical Materialism, his popularization, many would say mutilation, of Marxist philosophy, and The Foundations of Leninism. One, his codification, many would say mechanistic distortion of Lenin's ideas. Whatever the mix of texts, this surge of study gave core cadre an immersion in Marxist-Leninist doctrine as well as a common language for communication across geographic, racial, and organizational boundaries. It also combated, though never fully overcame, the strong current of anti-intellectualism that afflicted the movement. This had deep roots in the general anti-intellectualism of U.S. society and the less talk, more action impulses that predominated within sections of the late New Left. Further, for all its calls to study, the movement's worshipful attitude toward the Marxist-Leninist classics distorted the intellectual development of its adherents. Virtually all the movement's pioneer organizations stressed the universal truth of Marxism-Leninism and argued that theoretically, the challenge before U.S. communists was solely to apply this truth to concrete conditions in the U.S. This outlook suggested that all truly important theoretical questions had already been resolved, and it betrayed a certain fear that too much exploration of new theoretical terrain would lead inexorably toward a revisionist betrayal of revolutionary principle. In the movement's early years, when the boundaries of what was and was not acceptable had not yet been rigidly codified, the immersion of cadre and study of the classics tended to have a net positive effect. But particularly after 1974, see Chapter 9, the movement paid a terrible price for embracing this quest for orthodoxy. The corollary to studying the fundamentals was defining the lines of demarcation separating Marxism-Leninism from opportunism. The mandate for this task came from Lenin's dictum that before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Party builders thus analyzed the history of the socialist movement in terms of revolutionaries drawing one line of demarcation after another with allegedly opportunist trends: anarchism in the mid-19th century, social democracy in the early 20th century, Trotskyism in the 1920s. For Maoists, but also for many others who were critical of the USSR and seeking an explanation for its failings, the thesis that in the 1950s and 1960s a new line of demarcation had been drawn, with Soviet or modern revisionism, held tremendous appeal. The most comprehensive case for this view was presented in the CPC's early 1960s polemics, in particular the June 14, 1963 proposal concerning the general line of the international communist movement and the 9 supplementary comments which followed. Red Papers 1 had drawn its critique of the Soviet Party from this source, but the CPC went into much greater depth. They identified the Soviet 20th Party Congress in 1956 as the first step along the road of revisionism and accused Khrushchev of using his criticism of Stalin to negate the fundamental theories of Marxism-Leninism. The CPC argued that all the contradictions of the contemporary world were concentrated in the vast areas of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the storm centers of world revolution, and argued that the CPSU erred by failing to acknowledge the depth of the conflict in this component of the world struggle for socialism. The polemics made a major point of attacking the Soviet leadership for seeking reconciliation with Yugoslavia, charging that under Joseph Tito's rule Yugoslavia had restored capitalism. In the last comment, which differed somewhat in perspective from the others and was the only one written by Mao himself, the CPC charged that Khrushchev was taking the Yugoslav road and there was a danger of capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union itself. Evaluating the history of the CPUSA. Applying this framework to U.S. left history, the new movement considered the CPUSA a revolutionary party from its formation in the wake of the Russian Revolution up until the mid-1950s. The CP was credited with having made an outstanding contribution to organizing industrial workers, fighting racism, promoting internationalism, and building a broad popular front in the 1930s and 1940s. Even during its heyday, it was seen as having a tendency to downplay the importance of Marxist-Leninist theory and to make reformist errors in practical policy. Supposedly these came to a head with leader Earl Browder's move to transform the party into a loose, non-vanguarded communist political association in 1944. But according to the movement's received wisdom, Browder was criticized and expelled with the assistance of the international movement in 1945, and the CP regained its Marxist-Leninist bearings. Things allegedly went sour for good in the mid-1950s. A bitter internal battle erupted following Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin, which the new communist movement regarded as a conflict between revisionists and anti-revisionists. Supposedly the revisionists with Soviet backing triumphed at the CPUSA's 16th National Convention in 1957. In that interpretation, many members even further to the right quit the party, while the genuine Marxist-Leninists remained inside and tried to stave off the full consolidation of opportunism. In the early 1960s, when the differences between the CPC and CPTSU exploded into a public rupture, these anti-revisionists left the CPUSA or were driven out. The bulk then formed PL, which supposedly upheld Marxism-Leninism until it too degenerated in 1967 to 1968, leaving the vacuum to be filled by the new communist movement. This perspective was not unanimously held. Some activists and groups, especially in and around the Communist League, were much more negative about the CPUSA's history. They argued that the CP had been infected with opportunism and had played a reformist rather than a revolutionary role even during the 1930s. They also felt that many CP members credited with being anti-revisionists during the fight against Browder, in particular William Z. Foster, were revisionists themselves, and they disputed the idea that PL had ever been an anti-revisionist force. These differences were not of strictly theoretical interest. They had concrete practical implications, especially concerning whether or not to model the new movement's work on the Popular Front strategy of the 1930s CP. Though the stakes in this debate seemed large to those involved, the entire range of opinion was remarkably narrow. In light of the new material about the CPUSA that appeared beginning in the 1970s, books by both former members and new left historians, including Al Richmond, Peggy Dennis, Joseph Starbin, Mark Nazin, and Maurice Isserman, the oversimplified character of the revisionist versus anti-revisionist framework becomes apparent. But much of this material was still unpublished in the early 1970s, and at the time discussion in the new movement's ranks was no less sophisticated than the deliberations in other parts of the activist left, the United Front and the Proletarian Corps. When it came to translating ideological principles into strategy, the United Front Against Imperialism framework introduced in Red Papers 1 was dominant. The concept was inspired by a brief paragraph in the CPC's proposal concerning the general line: the proletarian parties in imperialist or capitalist countries must maintain their own ideological, political, and organizational independence in leading revolutionary struggles. At the same time, they must unite all forces who can be united and build a broad united front against monopoly capital and against the imperialist policies of aggression and war. The main article in Red Papers 2 elaborated BARU's application of this view to U.S. conditions, calling for a united front with 5 spearheads: 1. The national liberation of Black and Mexican American peoples and support for the democratic rights of all oppressed minorities; 2. Against imperialist aggression, support for colonial liberation; 3. Against fascism; 4. Against the oppression and exploitation of women; and 5. Unite the proletariat to resist the attack on living standards. Not everyone who accepted the United Front Against Imperialism formula agreed with the RU's interpretation. There was a wide spectrum of views about which constituencies would play the key roles within the front, the issues around which it should be built, and so on. And some circles rejected the whole formula and proposed alternatives, such as a united front against fascism concept drawn from the 7th World Congress of the Comintern in 1935, or a class-against-class position in which alliances with non-working class sectors played little or no role. Consistent with the movement's general ultra-left tilt, However, in the early 1970s, just about every group conceived of the United Front more as a collection of different sectors or organizations under party control than as an alliance of different political forces that were able to find a degree of common ground. Bound up with the question of strategy was settling on a class analysis, in particular, determining which sectors of the working class were destined to lead the class as a whole. To identify these key sectors, movement groups utilized mixtures of four criteria. 1. What groups of workers actually produce surplus value for the capitalists? 2. Which sectors consisted of large concentrations of workers employed in big enterprises? 3. Which sectors included the largest proportions of workers of color? And 4. Which workers labored under the most oppressive conditions? This analysis led most early organizations following communist tradition to target the industrial proletariat, workers in large-scale industry, mining, communication, and transportation, as the leading proletarian core of the working class. Others targeted the lower strata or deeper strata as the most reliable revolutionary force. These strata overlapped with the industrial proletariat, but tilted more in the direction of including many non-industrially but non-white and severely oppressed workers, while excluding some of the better paid and disproportionately white industrial workers. In either case, anti-revisionists simultaneously targeted the most privileged workers, termed the labor aristocracy, following Lenin, as the social base for the backward trade union bureaucracy and for the opportunist views that misled the majority of the working class. These perspectives contrasted sharply with analyses some descended from the new working class theories of the mid-1960s that gave weight to professional and technical workers, and are believed all categories of workers had equal political potential. The movement's focus on reaching the proletarian core necessarily required adopting a policy toward the trade unions. Most groups hewed to the traditional communist position that unions were the basic mass organizations of the working class, the first line of defense against employers, but were simultaneously limited to a reformist role by their acceptance of collective bargaining rules within capitalism. This generally translated into an approach of working within the existing labor movement with the aim of transforming it into a powerful bloc of class struggle unions. Only a few groups, for relatively brief periods, advocated boycotting the existing unions and trying to create pure radical alternatives, dual unionism. Still, the dominant tendency in the early 1970s saw the key to building class struggle unions as developing opposition caucuses in which communist cadre largely determined the caucus program and held dominant organizational influence. Skilled organizers utilizing this approach could often draw around themselves a small nucleus of left-leaning workers. But it did not encourage the formation of alliances with non-communist reform leaders, or even with cadre of other communist groups, nor did it give much priority to patient work with the rank-and-file workers who were not already radicals. This probing of strategy was not matched by much discussion about what society would look like after the revolution. Matters were left at the level of restating general formulas about the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat, with occasional additions about continuing the revolution along the lines of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or praise for Cuba's use of moral rather than material incentives. Movement propaganda would point to gains made by workers, peasants, or women in China, Cuba, or North Vietnam, but little was said about the structure of a socialist U.S., the national question. Beyond the foundation stones of ideology and strategy, two specific issues stood center stage in the movement's doctrinal self-definition: the national question and the question of international line. In this, the new communist current demonstrated its roots in the upheavals to the 1960s, whose central issues were racism and U.S. war-making abroad, as well as the influence of Third World-based revolutionary nationalism. The new movement devoted tremendous energy to analysis of the special oppression facing African Americans. To a lesser but still considerable extent, it tackled the situation of Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. The dominant approach was to term these issues the national question and to utilize the framework of national oppression and national liberation. Activists leaned heavily on the perspective developed by the Bolsheviks and adopted by the CPUSAs in the late 1920s, especially on Stalin's 1913 article Marxism and the National Question. A few voices within the movement felt that the use of national categories rather than racial categories, in particular, defining blacks as an oppressed nationality rather than as people singled out for special oppression via the social construct of race, was theoretically imprecise and reflected the mechanical application of a framework drawn from a different European experience. But the entire movement shared the same stress on the centrality of anti-racism and the vital role of people of color movements. Just about all new Marxist-Leninists held that peoples of color faced dual oppression as both oppressed racial or national groups and in their overwhelming majority as sectors of the working class. Consequently, freedom movements among peoples of color were simultaneously integral components of the working class movement and cross-class liberation struggles, having a revolutionary thrust in their own right. In the second respect, they were inextricably connected to the upsurge of liberation movements throughout the Third World. The very language of the time, which frequently referred to peoples of color within the U.S. as Third World peoples, reflected this perspective. Further, anti-revisionist doctrine honed in on the central role that white supremacy in general and black slavery in particular had played in the development of U.S. political economy, class structure, and ideology, indeed, in shaping the distorted definition of who constituted a real American. The movement thus regarded the fight against white supremacy and the battle for African American equality in particular as pivotal not just for socialist revolution but for all democratic advance. Movement groups articulated their anti-racist perspective in various ways. Common formulations called for building an alliance between the multinational working class and the oppressed nationalities and asserted that racism, or national oppression, constituted the main obstacle to working class unity. Within these parameters there were a range of views. Controversy existed, for instance, over whether or not the black or Chicano people constituted a distinct nation within the borders of the U.S. Stalin's article had defined a nation as a historically constituted, stable community of people, formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup, manifested in a common culture. Few in the movement challenged this definition, but debate raged over whether the African American or Chicano community fit its requirements. At stake was whether or not these peoples had the right of self-determination as used in the strict Leninist sense of the right, held by and only by full-fledged nations, to establish a distinct nation-state. There was a more popular usage of the term self-determination, which meant the right of oppressed minorities to form organizations independently of whites, to develop their own ideological positions, and exercise control in their communities. The new communist movement was among that section of the multiracial left most committed to defending this type of self-determination, and movement activists of color frequently led in constructing autonomous Third World organizations. But as the young Marxist-Leninist groups became increasingly concerned with articulating their views in orthodox terms, the significance of this popular usage was pushed into the background. As we will see later, it turned out that there was no direct correspondence between whether or not a particular group believed that black or Chicano people constituted a nation and whether or not it consistently supported black or Chicano self-determination in the broad sense of the term, or what stance a group took in any particular controversy over busing, affirmative action, and so on. There were also differences over how to analyze and approach the racial cleavages among workers. A few sections of the movement attached importance to the relative material privileges enjoyed by white workers, and stressed the need to identify and attack these in practical struggles and in educational work. But others regarded any stress on white privilege as abandoning a class-based perspective, and approached racism within the working class as a problem mainly of white workers' backward ideas. International line. Another central preoccupation was how to concretely express the Marxist-Leninist principle of proletarian internationalism. Overwhelmingly, building solidarity with national liberation struggles was considered a top priority. At the beginning of the 1970s, virtually all movement groups espoused some version of the thesis that U.S. imperialism was the main exploiter and enemy of the peoples of the Third World. This was the position of the Cuban and Vietnamese CPs, the main liberation movements in Africa and the Middle East, and the all but universal conclusion of young people radicalized during the period of the Vietnam War. It was also the mid-1960s position of at least one faction within the Chinese Communist Party. In 1965, Lin Biao, head of the Chinese People's Liberation Army and until 1971 the officially designated successor to Mao, had written in his widely circulated pamphlet Long Live the Victory of People's War, the contradiction between the revolutionary peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and the imperialists headed by the United States, is the principal contradiction in the contemporary world. But consensus over the principal contradiction did not rule out substantial differences within the ranks, particularly over the role of the Soviet Union. The partisans of Mao Zedong thought, led by RU and OL, argued for the post-1968 Chinese position, which was that the USSR had become a restored capitalist state and a social imperialist superpower that all revolutionaries must oppose. Those inclined toward a more general third worldism as well as soft Maoists subscribed to an alternative view, which was highly critical of the USSR but skeptical of the claim that it had become a capitalist country. The Guardian was the main nationwide advocate for the latter position. On the doctrinal level, these differences were quite sharp. Hard Maoists quoted Mao's 1970 statement that the Soviet Union today is under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of the German fascist type, of the Hitler type, while the Guardian described the USSR as socialist and called for a united front of all socialist countries in support of Vietnam. Likewise, while the Chinese and their closest supporters were increasingly hostile to most parties that retained close ties to the Soviets, Cuba especially, the Guardian, PWOC, and scores of Vencerium's brigade veterans promoted solidarity with Cuba as a touchstone of internationalism. These differences would eventually mature into a rupture that split the new communist movement down the middle. But in these early years they were overshadowed by unity in the ongoing mobilization against the Vietnam War, and by common solidarity with Beijing's campaign for recognition as the sole legitimate government of China. This was achieved when the UN ceded the People's Republic of China on October 25, 1971, and Nixon declared that Taiwan is part of China in February 1972. The Woman Question versus Women's Liberation. The pioneer anti-revisionist organizations did not give what they termed the woman question the same degree of attention as the struggle against racism or the question of international line, but Marxist-Leninist tradition and the reality of an exploding women's liberation movement demanded that it be given some weight. So did the very real commitment of movement cadre, especially women cadre, to women's equality. Early movement efforts broke little new ground. Genuine equality between the sexes can only be realized in the socialist transformation of society as a whole. Read the quotation from Chairman Mao on the cover of Red Papers 3, which laid out the RU's analysis. Initial theoretical engagement with sexism mainly consisted of arguing this proposition. Emphasis was placed on the links between women's oppression and capitalism, mainly on the use of women as a pool of cheap labor that could be moved in and out of the workforce, and on the experiences of working-class women and women of color. At least in these early years, any revisionism zeal in offering a class approach glossed over the depth and complexity of sexism as a form of oppression in its own right. These problems were partly due to limitations inherited from traditional communism, but they also stemmed from a one-sided reaction to dominant trends in the women's movement. Rather than appreciating that movement's vitality, its fresh insights, and the tremendous mark it was making on the entire society, the party builders of 1968 to 1973 focused overwhelmingly on its shortcomings, in particular its domination by white middle-class women. Marxist-Leninists weren't making this problem up. The class and race blind spots they noted were real. Moreover, these went beyond to be expected growing pains, since leading feminists made self-conscious choices that set women's liberation on a skewed class and racial trajectory. The most damaging was the decision to exclude black women from the women's movement's first nationwide gathering in the fall of 1968. The grounds for that decision, made by white women who all considered themselves radicals, was that the presence of black women, rather than being necessary for incorporating the experiences of all women, would shift the agenda away from sexism to racism. Inevitably, a set of serious problems, including the emergence of a virtually all-white women's movement, flowed from Th's backward decision. Under such circumstances, it was not surprising that young Marxist-Leninists, and not them alone, regarded the early 1970s women's movement as an attempt by privileged white women to write themselves out of the drama of racial oppression, in which they were part of the oppressor group, by writing themselves in as victims in the drama of gender domination. Equally galling was feminism's tendency to substitute facile analogies between sexism and racism for concrete analyses of their similarities and differences. Among other things, this obscured crucial differences in the way gender and race intersect with class. While women are distributed fairly evenly across the class spectrum, peoples of color are disproportionately concentrated in the lower class strata. It was because of such problems that most activists in minority communities, women and men both, looked askance at the early 1970s women's movement. Outright sexism was certainly part of the reason why many radical men denigrated women's liberation. But when an anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-sexist organization such as the Third World Women's Alliance was also refusing to identify with the white women's movement, these conflicts could hardly be attributed to male chauvinism alone. Still, The early new communists' narrow and mechanical approach only made the situation worse. It did not provide a framework for effectively combating class and racial blind spots or for unleashing the full radical potential of the anti-sexist struggle. Later, some of the second-wave Marxist-Leninist groups moved past reductionism to make far more sophisticated analysis of women's oppression. But by that time both anti-revisionism and the radical and socialist wings of the women's movement had lost their initial momentum, and the results were not nearly as great as they would have been had Marxist-Leninists adopted a more advanced viewpoint in 1968 to 1973. Outright homophobia, the first wave of party builders, also foundered in addressing the oppression of gay men and lesbians. Doctrinally, most of the movement simply ignored this issue, though The Guardian did decide by 1971 that it was appropriate to include opposition to discrimination against gays under the broad rubric of defending democratic rights. But whatever was formally said or not said, for the most part the movement's attitude toward homosexuality and the gay movement was decidedly negative. Fundamentally, most Marxist-Leninists shared the homophobia prevalent in society as a whole, and on the issue of gay rights they surrendered to prejudice instead of analyzing and opposing it. To rationalize homophobic attitudes that were increasingly being rejected by the progressive community, and especially by the women's movement, many party builders pointed to the anti-gay tradition of mainstream communism as well as the backward positions of the Chinese or Cuban CPs. Prior to World War I, several European socialist parties supported agitation for homosexual rights, and immediately after the October Revolution the Bolsheviks repealed all laws against homosexual activity. But this stance was reversed under Stalin, and intense hostility to homosexuality became the communist norm. The CPUSA generally followed suit, though in some pockets a more tolerant ethos prevailed. For instance, ex-CPUSA member Harry Hay, founder of the Matacaine Society in 1951, the first lasting gay rights organization in the U.S., spoke positively of the attitudes of many former comrades long after he had left the organization. But there were additional reasons that gave the movement's homophobia a particularly bitter edge. These were described by former Revolutionary Union leader Steve Hamilton. Communists are always having to defend unpopular, un-American notions such as anti-racism and communism. It is nice to be like any other worker on something, by and large, that is more possible on cultural issues in general and on something like that homosexuality, that after all has not much to do directly with worker versus boss oppression. Also, I think it has to do with why anyone is homophobic, i.e., one, fear of loss of sex role definition. As communists we want people to be tough, be fighters, so are you particularly tended toward glorifying the macho image for men? 2, a puritanical reaction to the sexual openness, greater flexibility in sexual expression that is suggested by homosexuality. Communists have to demand self-sacrifice, some subordination of personal fulfillment to political tasks, and if they resent doing it, they may be particularly bothered by the hedonism they perceive in people around them. The new communist movement, like much of the early 1970s socialist left, also accepted the myth that there were few if any gays and lesbians of color and or from working-class backgrounds. Together these sentiments resulted in homophobia pervading the first party-building groups. Most regarded gay liberation as an issue for privileged whites at best and a backward distraction from the class struggle at worst, and the majority of early groups prohibited open gays or lesbians from being members. The movement had a similar though less mean-spirited reaction toward the environmental movement. Again, there were grounds for criticizing environmentalism's then dominant trends. The first Earth Day in 1970, for instance, was promoted largely by establishment liberals spearheaded by Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson, who boasted that part of their agenda was to divert young people from anti-imperialism into a safe arena. Still, the Marxist-Leninists were unable to see beyond such maneuvers to appreciate the significance of one of the most crucial issues and vital movements of the 1970s and beyond, Mao Zedong thought. During its formative period, the foreground ideological self-definition of this new trend was anti-revisionist or Marxist-Leninist. The groups that hewed most closely to the outlook of the Chinese Communist Party considered Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought synonymous with contemporary Marxism-Leninism, but others in the movement, while praising Mao, refrained from or differed with this usage. The term Maoist was then regarded as a pejorative by all those sympathetic to Mao. Early on this seemed to many to be a mere semantic or tactical difference, but in fact it reflected the temporary coexistence within one movement of perspectives that would later prove incompatible. Maoism did provide the most elaborate framework available for early 1970s revolutionaries who were critical of the USSR. and it served as the new movement's strongest single reference point, but it did not and could not consolidate behind its banner all those who rallied to the perspective of Third World Marxism. For one thing, official proclamations notwithstanding, Mao Zedong thought was not a consistent doctrine. It contained different and only superficially compatible elements, and in fact was an amalgam of perspectives associated with different factions within the Chinese Communist Party. One tendency stuck closest to the orthodoxy of Marxism-Leninism as developed under Stalin. This was the dominant framework in the anti-revisionist polemics of the early 1960s. A second thread gave far more weight to Third World nationalism than classical Stalinism had done, and also tended toward populism in constantly emphasizing the people rather than the working class. Lin Biao's long loved the victory of People's War, which put forward a strategy of the countryside of the world surrounding the cities, most reflected this tendency. Finally, there was Cultural Revolution Maoism, with its emphasis on a constantly aroused populace bombarding the headquarters and creating socialism through ideological enthusiasm regardless of the level of technology, industry, and science, and without state institutions where workers could elect and recall their leaders. Infused with voluntarism, the view that human will can change history regardless of objective conditions, this view bordered on anarchism. Inspiring as it was to young radicals worldwide, it was more distant from classical Marxism than any other tendency in the CPC. Translating these threads into a perspective for U.S. revolutionaries made for a complicated mix. On the one hand, it was the Cultural Revolution and Lin Biao-style support for Third World liberation that first attracted U.S. radicals to China's banner. But in trying to turn this attraction into a concrete program, these same activists were inexorably drawn to the more comprehensive and more Stalinist anti-revisionist polemics. At the beginning of the 1970s, most cadre believed that all these threads constituted a coherent whole, but in China, the authors of the anti-revisionist polemics had been denounced and ousted from power as opponents of the Cultural Revolution, and Lin Biao fell from power and died in a suspicious plane crash while fleeing China in 1971 as the CPC leadership prepared to host Richard Nixon and begin its rapprochement with Washington. It was only a matter of time before conflicts along similar ideological lines broke into the open among U.S. Maoists. Even more important, the U.S. movement was not made up of activists who took leadership from the CPC alone. Many had a stronger affinity for the communist parties of Vietnam or Cuba, which both pursued their own independent revolutionary paths and regarded the USSR as a socialist bulwark and integral part of the world anti-imperialist front. The Vietnamese offered a traditional Leninist framework close in basic logic, though not on several specific assessments, to Chinese views in the early 1960s. The Cubans were the most willing to innovate ideologically, and were far more flexible about developing relationships with groups that did not originate within or even feel friendly to any section of the traditional communist movement. Meanwhile, other young Marxist-Leninists were influenced mainly by African revolutionary leader Amilcar Cabral, who also believed the USSR to be socialist, by ideas emphasizing autonomous organizations of workers prominent in the Italian extra-parliamentary left, or by Antonio Gramsci, whose major works were just beginning to circulate widely in English. It was inevitable that the full range of views within the international far left would find expression among U.S. radicals. It was perhaps more surprising that the CPC did not match its polemical aggressiveness about forming new anti-revisionist parties with any direct steps to promote unity among its international supporters. Even though the CPC compared its role to Lenin's anti-revisionism of 50 years before, it did not follow his course of organizing a new communist international. In contrast to the Bolsheviks in 1918 to 1923, the CPC called no conferences of anti-revisionist parties and sent no emissaries to other countries to promote Marxist-Leninist unity. In the 1920s, Comintern intervention had played a key role in the formation of a single U.S. Communist Party, and a few years later intervened to end factional warfare within the CPUSA. The CPC in the 1960s and 1970s took no such steps. Instead, the Chinese limited themselves to distributing literature, issuing abstract calls for unity, and establishing formal ties with various U.S. Maoist groups once these groups had been set up. In the early and mid-1960s, the CPC had ties with PL. During the early 1970s, it developed ties with both RU and OL. By and large, U.S. Maoists lauded the CPC stance as one of high principle. After all, one of the main criticisms of the Soviets was that the CPSU waved the baton trying to control the affairs of other parties. Had the CPC exercised its influence, it almost certainly could have imposed greater unity on the early new communist movement. But the history of the Comintern shows that there were far more problems than benefits when a party in one country, no matter how prestigious, tried to guide parties in another. Still, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems very unlikely that the CPC's hands-off approach was due to principled regard for equality among communists. It stemmed more from simple lack of interest. Only one faction within the Chinese Communist Party seemed to believe it important to develop a trend of like-minded communist parties, and its leaders were removed from power early in the Cultural Revolution. The other tendencies within the CPC saw little potential in revolutionary movements in the advanced capitalist world, and the dominant faction was much more interested in strengthening ties with Western governments. From its vantage point, it was useful to have groups in the U.S. promoting friendship with China and the Chinese view that the USSR was a dangerous superpower, but beyond that, it was irrelevant what policies a U.S. left group might pursue, or whether sympathizers with China formed a single party or not. No class anchor. Even if the CPC had acted differently, unity imposed from outside could only have been artificial and temporary. Far more decisive in determining the movement's future was the fact that it lacked a firm institutional anchor within a class or substantial class fraction inside the United States. The 1960s upheavals had weakened the traditional structures that exercised authority within the working class: unions, urban democratic party machines, conservative churches. But radical movements had not succeeded in taking over these institutions or creating alternatives that involved hundreds of thousands of workers. The new generation of radical youth, including those who came from working class and or oppressed minority backgrounds, were rebelling against the dominant institutions in their communities as frequently as they brought the social bases of those institutions with them. As these young activists adopted Marxism, they set the goal of sinking roots in the working class, but they were not embarking on this project with the extensive class and community ties that characterize a more stable cross-generational movement. Furthermore, despite the turmoil of the times, no large and cohesive section of the working class turned leftwards as a united social force. Individuals from crucial strata embraced radicalism, but not those strata as such. Students and youth brought energy and passion to the revitalized left, but they were an inherently transient layer destined to scatter across the class spectrum. Even the black movement provided only a partial exception. The African American community, then unique among communities of color in size and nationwide distribution, was alive with social protest, but the Black freedom movement was a cross-class phenomenon. Only in the late 1960s did the specifically working-class sectors of it develop independent radical vehicles and begin to act as an autonomous social force. Where this did occur, in Detroit more than anywhere else, it was possible to glimpse the potential power in a sustained interaction between revolutionary cadre and a coherent, in-motion social base, but this was too localized and fleeting a phenomenon to anchor a nationwide revolutionary trend. And even one solid stratum could only be a starting point. The U.S. is a huge country with an extremely complex social structure and a deeply fragmented working class. It would take a large, strategically located and politically active sector, maybe more than one sector, to provide a sufficient anchor for the development of a durable revolutionary movement. 3 decades earlier, the huge upsurge of workers employed in mass production had provided that kind of base for the development of the CPUSA. When such a powerful section of the working class takes the stage, it provides revolutionary activists with a reference point and reality check, an arena for large-scale organizing that not only develops their practical skills but provides strong incentive to maintain unity in action while debating differences. And the history of the left worldwide indicates that a large and active grassroots base is a powerful force for democratic practices within left organizations. Of course, the work of revolutionaries often plays a role in laying the groundwork for mass upsurges, but the main factor is the way millions spontaneously respond to injustice and exploitation. Revolutionaries can sometimes shape the direction of mass movements, but they cannot create them on their own. In its formative years, the new communist movement lacked that kind of class anchor. Most of its adherents recognized this, but they counted on one emerging a short way down the road. They envisioned this occurring partly through their own efforts and partly through the spontaneous spread of the 1960s spirit of resistance. But most of all, they anticipated further national liberation victories that would exacerbate internal class contradictions in the U.S., producing a capitalist onslaught against workers and a massive working-class response. This seemed quite plausible at the time, and not just to radicals, but in the meanwhile this young movement had to hammer out its strategy, build its structures and develop its work. On the plus side, movement cadre were immersed in a variety of vibrant social movements. They functioned within a large, if loose, revolutionary milieu, and felt themselves part of a rising worldwide revolutionary trend. All this gave them a running start. But the lack of a class anchor meant that there were only limited checks on the tendency of a youthful movement to try to force history to move faster through isolated acts of confrontation and other forms of ultra-leftism, with a tendency of a movement disproportionately composed of individuals from the intelligentsia to lose its sense of proportion about theoretical differences and fall into self-destructive infighting. Likewise, the pressures from the broader society toward racial, sectoral, and geographical fragmentation were not countered by sentiments bubbling up from a vigilant multiracial base. They had to be fought mainly via ideological and organizational means, and there is a long history of left parties that lack a solid class base at home becoming dependent on models and franchises from abroad. The lack of a class anchor also contributed to the revolutionary left taking shape as a number of mutually hostile trends rather than a more cooperative alignment. Without minimizing the ideological and sociological differences between new Communist Party builders, CPUSA supporters, revolutionary nationalists, and others, the way their disagreements manifested themselves in bitter sectarian battles was at least partly framed by this problem. A more cohesive class base for the left, which in various ways would have held all radical forces accountable for advancing its interests, might have changed the equation, offering immediate negative consequences for unchecked intra-left conflict. All this made for a set of delicate balances in the early new communist movement. Its young cadres' intense commitment and energy drove the movement forward, but frequently hovered on the edge of counterproductive adventurism. Early debates over differences gave the movement an intellectually stimulating and democratic character, but too frequently broke down into point-scoring and name-calling. The movement drew strength from its identification with national liberation movements, but the temptation to import their strategies for use in the U.S. threatened disaster. The new communist movement thus had to walk a tightrope as it sought to turn youthful revolutionary enthusiasm into a mature political trend. Success was possible, but without a class base external to itself to provide an anchor, a great deal depended upon self-conscious decisions about how to focus its partisans' energies. Those decisions, in turn, were bound up with the way the movement conceived of its chosen task, building a new Marxist-Leninist party.